So I think that, if I were to look back 3 to 5 years from now, I would not be surprised. I'd be mostly confident this is probably going to look at a pretty significant buying opportunity in Bitcoin. So to answer your first question, I think the last 10,000 move was somewhat surprising to me. I think that was below my base case. I would not have been surprised to see us go below 30. I think going below 20 what was a deeper capitulation than I would have guessed several months ago. And for people who've been following my work, generally, Bitcoin and cryptos do well in rising PMI environments. So Purchasing Managers Index, economic acceleration, they usually do well in that kind of environment. And then they usually do poorly or sideways in declining PMI environments, economic contraction type of environments. And those are generally these like 3-year cycles that the global economy goes through, US economy, global economy. And so, I had been getting cautious in the tactical sense about the fact that we were going through a declining PMI environment, and then therefore that can put a lot of pressures on Bitcoin, despite the fact that I would say still structurally long-term bullish on it, but then being aware of that kind of downside. Luna was something that I wrote about and expected and cautioned about, where something more opaque like 3 Hours Capital is kind of the second leg to that. It's just that one's harder to predict. And so I think the environment we're in now is that we've had a pretty deep capitulation. It's always hard to say if you're at the ultimate bottom or not, but this does look a lot like the late 2018 capitulation, where Bitcoin, for a while, Bitcoin was kind of stabilizing around 6,000, and then it just out of nowhere got cut in half, down to almost 3,000 when you had the Fed tightening and you had, problems in credit markets and you had this kind of contagion. And so I think that we've gone through a similar capitulation now where, Bitcoin looked like it was trying to bottom around 30,000, it was kind of that level environment, and then out of nowhere, it got just completely capitulated down to sub 20,000. So I by most metrics, it's in a pretty deep value zone, right? So it's below the average on-chain cost basis. It touched below the 200-week moving average, which it almost never does. Basically, we've had a lot of forced selling. I mean, generally, you want to be a buyer during forced selling and a trimmer when everyone's euphoric. So I think that if I were to look back 3 to 5 years from now, I would not be surprised. I'd be mostly confident this is probably going to look at a pretty significant buying opportunity in Bitcoin. And so I'm not necessarily expecting any sort of explosive recovery anytime soon. But I do think that any interested people might want to look into this space, because I think this is a time to consider start laying capital in, or to start maybe building up a position, or at least studying it to see if it's something you eventually want to go into. Because I first bought Bitcoin during the it was April 2020, so we were just coming out of that whole COVID crash, and that was the last time, that was the 4th time ever that Bitcoin was below its on-chain cost basis, and now it's the 5th time, and so in many ways it looks like that earlier type of environment, and so I'm pretty optimistic long term on where we are now, while still cautioning that the next 3 to 6 months, anything can really go when you're in this type of weak economic environment with low liquidity. Bitcoin itself had more of a rolling top, so I was kind of, as a base case, maybe expecting it not to capitulate as much as it did in some of its prior cycles. That was before the whole 3 Hours Capital implosion. It was kind of the second leg of that divestiture. So basically, given how low sentiment was, and given what was happening with inflation in a number of markets, I was kind of expecting that upper 20s position might hold. I was, the way I was analyzing it with my client was saying that I think this is a reasonable value zone. It's not a deep value zone. It's not a capitulation. And I kind of kept looking back at that 2018 chart and being like, this, you could have a pretty violent. So I wasn't ruling out this kind of final capitulation type of phase, but wasn't necessarily expecting it either. But now that we've gotten it, I am kind of more confident than I was a number of months ago about kind of, recommending that people at least consider looking into layering in or researching the protocol just to see if it's something that they're interested in. Basically, I think that now we have a pretty severe washout in terms of liquidated leverage, forced sellers. This is the time where I don't mind, picking some up and kind of being on the other side of that trade. I mean, capitulation is basically an explosive type of bottom where you go down to what roughly ends up being kind of a bottoming zone very quickly. Whether or not that is the precise bottom or not, as I think, not like as you pointed out, that's not the main question. The question is the worst of it behind us, right? And so obviously we
Right.
won't know until years in advance what the actual bottom was. When you have forced selling, when you have bank runs, when you have just basically uncontrolled liquidations, that's the type of event that usually marks a capitulation.
Yeah.
Whereas, when you look back at the 2018 Bitcoin price action, you had that kind of deep capitulation, but it's not as though you got some rapid bounce back. You stayed down there and chopped along sideways for a long period of time. I forget
Yes.
exactly what day the bottom occurred on. And of course, even you recovered and then chopped along, and then a
Yeah.
couple years later during the COVID, you actually kind of went back down briefly to roughly where that bottom was. You kind of very briefly retested those types of 2018 bottoming zones. So a bottoming can be a process. But I would describe capitulation as kind of this like explosive moment of forced selling. A lot of kind of previously high conviction entities throwing in the towel, sentiment bottoming out, and then kind of being able to at least start the process of reconstruction, which might not mean the bottom's in, but I think that means that the explosive selling might be behind us because you had so many bank runs and problems with these kind of exchanges, custodial type things. You've actually seen a really sharp uptick in the number of people holding Bitcoin on chain, and so if you look at small users, people that own maybe one Bitcoin or half a Bitcoin or 2 or 3 Bitcoin. A lot of those have actually taken their coins off exchanges and held them in a hardware wallet. And I was told the other day from one of the main hardware makers that the CEO of that company that they've had unusually big surge in sales for hardware wallets, which they don't generally experience during price declines. And so I think that's one of the more bullish catalysts out there that I think that people are kind of seeing the usefulness of Bitcoin as a self-custodial peer-to-peer type of money, even though in the price sense, as a piece of collateral, as a piece of leverage that is getting kind of forced sold in this kind of casino of broad crypto, I think that's the bearish part. But I think the underlying fundamentals that are happening, I still think long-term are bullish. So I think that basically social media is super bearish. If I tweet about Bitcoin, there's usually a lot of people that are trashing it, saying it's totally done. There are always pockets of bullishness. I mean, there are a lot of permabulls in the space that they're constantly trying to call bottoms. And so that's always concerning to see. I kind of want them to stop trying to call bottoms, and so eventually they'll be right, but who knows when they're going to be right. And so I think that sentiment can always get worse. I mean, things can always be worse. Any sort of capitulation can eventually have an even deeper capitulation. So I don't think people should take that as a thing saying, okay, it can't go lower, let's go leverage long, right? That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that we're in a total capitulation type of environment where smart long-term investors might want to analyze the technology, might want to analyze the market and see if it's something that they're interested in. I certainly am more bullish given a 3 to 5 year view from these price levels than I have been for the past couple years. My contrarian signal is kind of going up here. So I think the next, like, say 0 to 12 months is still very difficult to call because I think we're currently still in an economic decelerating environment. Now, historically, Bitcoin tends to bottom before PMI bottoms, right? So this might have been roughly the bottom, and then you still have economic deceleration because basically what you start to do is then you price in more dovish central bank policy, more liquidity, things like that. So basically, the price bottom in such a volatile asset can precede the bottom of the actual economic situation. Doesn't mean it always has to work like that, but it's something to keep in mind. So I think the next 0 to 6 to 12 months is still very uncertain, where you could chop along, you could rise moderately, you could maybe see a lower low, but maybe not as explosive as we've already seen. And then I think that when you have a rising PMI environment, looking out, say in the next 6 to 24 months or 6 to 36 months, I think that's where I'd be more structurally bullish.